I played a rapid game recently as black, and we opened with a double king's pawn opening. And I've been working on the Petrov defense, knight f6, but it didn't go into the main move, knight takes e5. My opponent played knight c3, and we transposed into a four knights game. In this position, the most popular move is bishop b5, called the Spanish Four Knights, which is like the Spanish or Ruy Lopez opening, but with these extra knights developed. Another popular move in this position is to play d4, which is called the Scotch Four Knights, and it's just like the Scotch opening with these two knights inserted. Okay. Instead of those two popular moves, my opponent played the much less popular Italian Four Knights, bishop to c4. And I think the reason this isn't so popular is because of the response knight takes e4. And this illustrates an important tactic to know about. It arises in a lot of openings. The point of this move is if white captures that knight, then black gets a piece back with this fork. Okay, it's called the central fork trick, and so it's something to watch out for. It happens in a lot of openings. And play would continue bishop to d3, black would take the knight, and white would recapture the pawn, probably bishop d6 here, and the game's equal. So I think black has already equalized. White can't really say he's got an advantage in this opening, which is why I don't think the Italian Four Knights is very popular for white. But my opponent actually didn't capture my knight. As soon as I took on e4, my opponent was aware of the central fork trick, and so played bishop takes f7 check, figuring, well, he's going to lose his piece back anyway, so why doesn't he get this f7 pawn and draw the black king out? Well, it turns out to be a big mistake. That's definitely not the way white should be playing this opening, because after I capture the bishop, he has to recapture my knight. Well, then I have the move d5, and I have this very strong pawn center here, and it's not such a big deal that my king is out in the open. In fact, it generally gets tucked back in here to h7 anyway. Takes a few moves to do that, but black already has good development with the diagonals for the bishop, the two bishops open. So it's just a superior position for black. Now my opponent made a further mistake by playing the knight from e to g5 check. Should have just put it back on g3. But playing it to g5 is a mistake because it's going to get pushed back in a moment, and the only square it can move back to is this miserable square on h3. It doesn't really want to be there on h3. So I continued with king to g8. My opponent played d6, perhaps, d3, perhaps d4 would have been more ambitious. And then I kicked the knight away. And notice I wanted to play that pawn move anyway to get my king out of the way so I can develop my rook. So I'm just getting a tempo here on the knight. So the knight dropped back to h3. I pin his knight on f3 while I'm developing. Seems like a strong, sensible move, and my bishop can't even get kicked away by a pawn because he just placed his knight there on h3. So my opponent makes a desperate move here. I'm not sure why he had to do this. Knight to g1, protecting this knight. Perhaps he saw my queen coming to f6 and attacking f3 again. Perhaps he wants to release his queen here from the pin without having to recapture with a pawn. But that's a desperate move. You don't want to put your pieces back on their original squares. You can already tell black has a crushing position with his extra development. So I decide to open it up and attack that pinned knight. So I play e4. My opponent captures. He's forced to capture. He doesn't want to lose his knight. And then I recapture. And then the way my opponent saves his pinned knight is by trading queens. Okay, then he can move his knight away. But the position is now wide open and my bishops are going to take control. So I play knight to d4, threatening a fork here on c2, and there's no way for white to guard that pawn. If he pushes it to save the pawn, he's just going to get his rook taken in the corner. There's no piece that can guard c2, so he has to either move his king or his rook, and he's going to lose a pawn. So he opts to move his rook over. I take the pawn and call check, forcing his king to this awkward f1 square. And then I continue to attack with bishop to b4, so the knight on d2 is hit twice. And white's already lost in this position. I don't even have to take the time to develop my other rook to finish off the game. Okay, my opponent tries to kick my bishop away, but I just redeploy it to e6, which is going to allow me in some cases to play it to c4 to hit the king and even threaten checkmate. Okay, my opponent makes the move knight to b3, which just hastens his demise. His knight was guarding the c4 square, was also blocking my rook's incursion here, although I suppose there was no way to guard that knight. It's under attack twice. Maybe king to e2 could be considered, but I don't think there's any way out of this. So he plays knight to b3. I check, okay, and that forces him to block with the knight, and then we've got mate. Okay, so quick game. Never try to take that pawn on f7 in this position. You're going to get a miserable game. Black's going to get a strong center. I'll also point out that this sometimes happens in another opening. This has happened to me several times. If white plays the bishop's opening here, I like to play knight to f6, and sometimes my opponent plays knight to c3 to guard his pawn. Well, I take it and we play the central fork trick idea again. Okay, and very often in this position, my opponent takes on f7, which is also a mistake. Because of the same reasons, I'm going to get a tempo on this knight. Okay, and furthermore, my opponent often calls check here, which is not as bad as in the last opening because at least he has this retreat square. But then again, that's where this knight wants to be. So that's probably not a very good move either. So here's another case where black is winning. So don't try to take that f7 pawn in order to avoid that central fork trick. Better yet, don't play the Italian four knights at all. All right, thanks for watching the video.